June 19, 1944. The Philippine Sea boiled with the clash of empires. On that morning, Japan unveiled its newest pride, the Carrier Taihō. Wrapped in armor, bristling with aircraft, she was hailed as unsinkable, the fortress that would turn the tide of war. But could steel and pride really defy fate? She was Japan's last hope. Yet within hours, that hope would sink in fire and smoke. By sunset, more than 1,600 sailors would never return home. How could the fortress meant to save an empire vanish in a single day? Her decks swarmed with pilots ready to strike, her crew confident they sailed aboard the future of naval warfare. But fate needed only one torpedo. At 8:10 a.m., the American submarine USS Albacore fired its spread. 6 torpedoes raced forward. Most missed. One was intercepted in mid-ocean by a Japanese pilot who sacrificed himself. Yet one slipped through and struck Taiho. At first, the damage seemed minor. The carrier continued, her engines strong, her flight deck alive with planes. But below decks, gasoline fumes silently spread, filling passageways, seeping into lungs, turning Taiho into a floating bomb. By nightfall, she was gone, 1,650 men swallowed by fire and sea. How could Japan's most advanced carrier fall in her very first battle? Was it the torpedo or the fatal mistake that followed? To find out, we must relive Taiho's final 10 hours of agony. To understand why Taiho's loss was so devastating, we must look at what she represented. After the shattering defeat at Midway in 1942, Japan's carrier force was crippled. 4 frontline carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, had been lost in a single day. The Imperial Navy needed a miracle, a new flagship that could restore confidence and challenge the ever-growing American fleet. That miracle was Taiho. Commissioned in March 1944, she was unlike any carrier Japan had built before. At over 34,000 tons full load, she was smaller than the giants Akagi and Kaga, but more advanced in design. Her most revolutionary feature was her armored flight deck, 3 inches of steel meant to resist bomb hits that had devastated earlier carriers. Japanese officers proudly called her the floating fortress. Taiho carried nearly 65 aircraft, a formidable air wing of Zeros, Judys, and Jills, and bristled with anti-aircraft guns. More importantly, she was intended to serve as the flagship of Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's mobile fleet. For Japanese sailors and pilots, boarding Taiho felt like stepping onto the future. They believed she was proof that Japan could still innovate, still strike back, still win. On her decks, young pilots whispered that Taiho would be their shield against American bombs. Below, engineers admired her armored hangars and reinforced bulkheads. After years of defeats, the crew clung to a single hope. This ship could endure what others could not. Yet this confidence masked a bitter irony. Taiho's very design, her reliance on aviation fuel storage deep within her armored hull, would one day contribute to her downfall. No one aboard could imagine it then. On the morning of June 19, 1944, they sailed out believing Taiho was invincible. In truth, they were sailing into a trap from which the ship would never return. By mid-June 1944, the Pacific was no longer the same ocean Japan had once dominated. The American advance through the Central Pacific had reached the Marianas, threatening Saipan, Guam, and Tinian, vital outposts that Japan could not afford to lose. If these islands fell, American B-29 bombers would be within range of Tokyo itself. In desperation, the Imperial Navy launched Operation Ago, a plan to lure the U.S. Pacific Fleet into a decisive carrier battle. Taiho, newly commissioned, was chosen as flagship for Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa. It was her first combat sortie, and the pride of the Japanese fleet now carried the weight of the Empire's hopes. On June 18th, Ozawa's force steamed west of the Marianas. Taiho led a powerful armada. Carriers Shokaku, Zuikaku, Junyo, and Hio, escorted by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. Together, they formed one of the last great carrier strike forces Japan could muster. To the Japanese sailors, the sight of so many warships stretched across the horizon was inspiring. They still believed in the doctrine of the decisive battle. But unseen beneath the waves, the U.S. Navy had laid a deadly ambush. American submarines prowled the approaches to the Marianas, positioned to intercept Ozawa's fleet. Among them was the USS Albacore, commanded by Commander James W. Blanchard, with the legendary Dick O'Kane, later famed for his exploits on USS Tang, serving as executive officer. Their orders were clear: find and cripple the enemy's carriers before they could launch their air groups. On the morning of June 19th, radar screens aboard Taiho lit up with reports of American forces. Pilots prepared for the massive air battle that would later be called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. But before Taiho's aircraft could strike, danger was already closing in from below. At 8:10 a.m., Albacore maneuvered into firing position. The submarine's periscope rose briefly above the waves, revealing the imposing silhouette of Taiho at the head of the Japanese formation. To the crew of Albacore, this was the perfect target: Japan's newest and most prized carrier. Blanchard ordered a spread of 6 torpedoes. The steel fish lunged from their tubes, hissing through the Pacific toward the massive ship. Aboard Taiho, lookouts screamed warnings. The sea around her erupted in foam trails, and the order went out: hard to port. In the chaos that followed, one young pilot, Ensign Komatsu, performed an act of desperate heroism. As he prepared for takeoff, he spotted the incoming torpedoes. Instead of climbing into the sky, he gunned his engine, deliberately steering his Zero straight into one of the wakes. The explosion consumed his plane, but it detonated the torpedo before it could strike Taiho. His sacrifice saved the carrier from certain destruction, at least for the moment. For the crew, he would be remembered simply as the man who gave his life, so their ship might live a little longer. But he could not stop them all. One torpedo slipped past the defenses and slammed into Taiho's starboard side near the forward aviation fuel tanks. The blast shook the ship violently, throwing men off their feet. For a moment, it seemed catastrophic. Yet when the smoke cleared, Taiho was still afloat, her engines turning, her flight deck intact. Planes continued to launch. To many aboard, it felt like confirmation of her reputation. The armored carrier had survived what might have sunk a lesser ship. Damage control reported flooding in several compartments, but no critical systems were lost. The crew's relief was palpable. Sailors cheered that the ship was still fighting. Officers reassured the men that Taiho's armor design had proven itself. To the outside observer, it looked as though the carrier had shrugged off the torpedo. But deep inside the ship, something far more dangerous had begun. Aviation fuel from ruptured lines seeped into the bilges and ventilation ducts. Invisible, odorless fumes spread through passageways and machinery rooms. The torpedo alone had not killed her. Instead, Taiho was becoming a floating powder keg, waiting for a single spark. At first, the crew of Taiho felt reassured. The armored giant was still steaming at high speed, her air group continued to launch, and the torpedo strike had not broken her backbone. Men on deck believed they had witnessed proof that Japan had finally built a carrier that could withstand punishment. But below the armored flight deck, the truth was far more sinister. The torpedo's explosion had ruptured aviation fuel tanks and pipelines. Raw gasoline began leaking into the forward compartments. The fuel-laden air crept into the ship's labyrinth of passageways and machinery rooms. Heavy as fog, it displaced oxygen, choking men in the lower decks. Engineers coughed and staggered as they tried to contain the leaks, while damage control teams fought to seal off affected areas. Sailors reported headaches and dizziness, some even collapsing at their posts. The ship was alive on the surface, but below, it was suffocating. One survivor later recalled, "The air was so thick with fuel it felt like drowning before the sea even touched us." In that critical moment, discipline and procedure mattered more than steel armor. Proper action would have been to vent the compartments directly overboard and secure all electrical equipment to prevent sparks. Instead, confusion reigned. Officers debated whether to keep the ventilation running or to shut it down entirely. In the engine spaces, a damage control officer made the fateful decision to activate the ventilation fans, hoping to clear the fumes. Instead, the fans only spread the gasoline vapors throughout the ship, turning isolated pockets into a suffocating blanket that reached every corridor and compartment. It was a fatal mistake. Some sailors noticed the change and grew uneasy. Men reported headaches, dizziness, even fainting spells. Mechanics, wiping their brows, found their rags soaked with fumes. Yet above, the flight deck bustled with activity, and officers insisted that the carrier was still fit to fight. They told themselves the armored hangars and sealed bulkheads would hold. Hours dragged on. Noon approached, the ship's belly filled with poison gas, while her crew carried on as though the danger had passed. Every plane that launched burned more fuel, feeding the invisible tide beneath their feet. Taiho had survived the torpedo, but now her greatest strength, her armored, enclosed design, was turning into a death trap. By midday, Taiho was a ship caught between two realities. On the surface, she still looked formidable. Her flight deck buzzed with activity as Zero fighters and dive bombers roared into the sky, reinforcing Japanese strikes against the American fleet. Vice Admiral Ozawa remained confident, issuing orders from the bridge as if nothing had changed. From a distance, she looked every bit the unsinkable armored carrier she had been advertised to be. But below decks, the nightmare worsened. A volatile haze pooled in engineering spaces, magazines, and crew quarters. Sailors grew dizzy and nauseous as the air thickened. Some collapsed at their stations, overcome by the invisible poison. Others whispered fears of a spark, a cigarette, or a loose wire that could ignite the whole ship. Damage control parties fought bravely, but were hindered by confusion. Reports contradicted one another. Some compartments were sealed tight, while others were forced open by ventilation systems, spreading the fumes further. Senior officers debated furiously. Should they vent the gas to the sea or keep the fans running to protect pilots and flight operations? In the end, indecision was as deadly as error. Orders shifted from hour to hour, and with every delay, the toxic vapor grew worse. Men sensed something was terribly wrong. Below the armored deck, the air felt heavier, harder to breathe. Conversations fell into whispers. Sailors scribbled hurried letters to loved ones during rare, quiet moments, knowing there might be no chance later. Others clutched keepsakes, praying silently in the darkness. By early afternoon, Taiho was no longer just a warship. She was a ticking bomb, her 10 hours of agony counting down. The clock was ticking, and the crew didn't know how close they were to death. Shortly after 2:30 in the afternoon, the inevitable happened. Deep within Taiho's armored hull, the concentration of gasoline fumes reached its breaking point. Somewhere below decks, perhaps from an electrical spark, perhaps from machinery still running, a flash ignited the fumes. In an instant, the forward sections of the carrier erupted in a deafening explosion. The blast tore through compartments like a giant's fist, hurling men against steel bulkheads, ripping doors from hinges, and sending fireballs roaring down passageways. Black smoke and flames shot skyward from vents and elevator shafts, choking the flight deck. Aircraft fueled and armed for launch ignited in a chain reaction, adding their bombs and gasoline to the inferno. Panic swept the ship. Men scrambled for fire hoses, while others tried to seal bulkheads to contain the blaze. But Taiho's armored design now worked against her. The very steel meant to protect her trapped the fury inside. With each passing minute, the fires spread, feeding on the volatile mixture of fuel and oxygen. By 3:30 p.m., the carrier was mortally wounded. Entire compartments were engulfed in flames, and the ship's list began to worsen. Survivors recalled the terrifying heat radiating through the decks, forcing men to abandon their posts. Officers gave frantic orders to abandon ship, but communication broke down amid the chaos. Some thought she might still survive. But fate had one final explosion to deliver. Time was running out, and no one could stop it. At 5:30 p.m., the end came. A final, catastrophic explosion ripped through the carrier's center. Witnesses on nearby ships saw it, a towering column of smoke and flame. It climbed thousands of feet into the sky. When it cleared, Taiho was broken. Her mighty hull cracked open, her stern lifting as seawater poured inside. Within minutes, the armored giant rolled and slipped beneath the waves, taking with her nearly 1,650 officers and sailors. Only about 500 men were pulled from the sea, many burned or half-conscious from fumes. For those who watched from the surrounding Japanese fleet, it was an unthinkable sight. The Navy's most advanced carrier, gone in her very first battle. The armored fortress that was supposed to change the war had not lasted a single day. And in the silence that followed, as the waves closed over Taiho, Japan's hopes of regaining naval supremacy vanished with her. The loss of Taiho was more than the sinking of a single ship. It was the collapse of an illusion. Japan had pinned its hopes on this unsinkable armored carrier, a symbol of technological progress and naval pride. Yet, in her very first battle, she was undone not by overwhelming enemy firepower, but by one torpedo and a series of human mistakes. For the Japanese Navy, the shock was profound. Taiho had been meant to spearhead a decisive victory at the Philippine Sea, to restore confidence after Midway. Instead, her destruction became a grim reflection of the battle itself. On that same day, waves of Japanese aircraft were slaughtered in what American pilots mockingly called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Hundreds of veteran aviators were lost, leaving Japan's carrier fleet hollow. With Taiho gone, the mobile fleet was reduced to shadows of its former glory. Among survivors, memories of her final hours lingered with bitterness and sorrow. Many spoke of the suffocating fumes, the confusion of orders, the terror of explosions echoing through steel corridors. Some could never forget the sacrifice of the pilot who gave his life to stop one torpedo, only for another to slip through. To them, Taiho's sinking was not just a naval defeat. It was a tragedy of wasted courage. For history, Taiho remains a warning. Armor and steel can protect against shells and bombs, but they cannot shield against flawed decisions. The carrier's fate showed that the mightiest warship is only as strong as the men who command and crew her. When the sea closed over Taiho, it did more than swallow 1,650 lives. It buried Japan's last hope for naval resurgence. The empire that had once ruled the Pacific night now faced the dawn of its decline. And so, the question echoes still. Was Taiho's end destiny, or a disaster of human making? Share your thoughts below. Would you blame the torpedo or the men who made the fatal decisions? Drop your judgment in the comments. We want to hear what you think.